Everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we are honored to have with us Christina Hoff Sommers, a prominent author, philosopher, and scholar known for her thought provoking perspectives on feminism and gender issues. Christina is a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute and someone who, growing up in America, I read a lot of her stuff, and I thought it was interesting to connect with her now from Israel, now that I've been here for a long time, to see first of all, what she thinks about what maybe the differences between America and Israeli society on these issues, and also what's happening in the West in general. So, Christina Hoff Sommers, it's amazing to speak with you. It's a great honor.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be someone in Israel. I'm thinking about Israel every minute and wish I were there with you, and maybe I will be there one day soon.
When it calms down, you're invited. So maybe let's start just with something general that I wanted to ask you. Um, what you're known for, and when I used to read your stuff, was about, I remember you wrote the book about the war on boys, and also Who Stole Feminism, which was, I think those were the main things that I think I even read them at the time. And where are we today? Because I think we're probably in a much worse place than we ever were on these issues. So, and maybe on the boys issue, it seems to me that we're in a war on girls too, with all the transgender things that are happening now, girls sports. So where do you see feminism now, the third wave feminism? I think we're probably like a fifth wave now, where it's not even feminism.
Sometimes I wonder, some of the feminists that I used to battle with, they were called radical, and I was a moderate. Now I'm siding with them because they are called TERFs.
Yeah.
They're and they're denigrated because they want to defend women's spaces. And I don't necessarily, I mean, I guess I do want to defend women's spaces, and I'm finding that I have allies who were once my opponents. So it's been an interesting evolution.
Yeah. Christina, one more thing that I wanted to ask you was that the war against boys, where are we on that today? Because we hear, I think when you wrote the book, the whole like phrase toxic masculinity is something that's pretty new in popular culture. It might have been in academic circles, but I certainly don't remember people saying that to be masculine is toxic. And it seems that, well, I'm in a religious community, but it seems to me that when you're in a secular American or Western community, it's almost a shame to be a boy, to have boy traits, let's put it that way.
Yes, well, being a boy in many circles has become a pathology in need of a cure. And in many of our schools, I'm not sure this is entirely true in Israel, but it's certainly true in the United States, classrooms are run primarily by women for girls, and boys are there on sufferance.
Yeah.
And and I'm generalizing, there are many kids who defy the stereotypes of their sex, but let's face it, most kids embody them. And so you have a little boy, it's much harder to interest him in the written word. Girls are on average a year to a year and a half ahead of boys in reading. They get better grades.
Right.
They are much less likely to be disciplined. They're less likely, when it comes to high school, to drop out, and far more likely to go to college. And this gap it keeps growing. It's threatening to become a chasm. But our schools of education and others, government officials, Department of Education, will do nothing because they are so fixated on the idea that girls are second-class citizens and victims of patriarchal oppression. They're living in another era. This is not the case.
Right.
And it's very hard. Many of us have written books, and there are many people that try to bring attention to the boy gap in education, and even in life, in other areas, in health. Men's health is neglected. In the United States, we have dozens of offices on women's health. The CDC has a whole section, women's health. There's no men's health. So, and yet all the programs are catered to women. When men die several years earlier, get most of the major diseases as many as 10 years earlier, even something like COVID, it was mostly men far more men than women who died.
Yeah.
And yet this doesn't somehow, it can't be acknowledged. It violates the narrative that's popular in our major institutions.
Do you think that what we see now in the polls now with the election coming up, that there is a major divide between the sexes or genders? I don't. It doesn't matter to me how you call it, but the fact is that women tend to vote more to the left, and men are more and more moving to the right. And do you think that has to do with the fact, like what you're saying, that there is a perpetual sort of messaging going out by the elites or by the institutions saying, women, you are being oppressed, you are second class, and so they're going to a certain position. But men feel instinctively a lot of times, I think, especially young men, that they're being left out, maybe, that they're having more trouble getting jobs, education, and all the stuff that you just mentioned. So do you think that's having an effect also on like separating of the sexes, that people don't feel comfortable with the other sex?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate how, uncomfortable boys and girls are together, because they tend to find their way to one another. But it is interesting that there's been a difference, this gap in voting preferences. And it's almost as if in the United States, the Democrat is the mommy party and the Republicans is the daddy party.
Exactly.
And it's sort of surprising to me, even with younger voters. You look now, and majority of young men are drifting towards the right. And people say, well, they're getting radicalized on social media, and that the young women are influenced more. They have influencers on TikTok and so forth, because this is driving the difference. But I don't really have a good explanation for it, except that I do think if you are a young man struggling in school, and less likely than the young woman sitting next to you, less likely than her to be teacher's pet or, valedictorian, or going to college, and yet you're told over and over again that you are you are the one that possesses the privilege in the society, and she's underprivileged, and that can be pretty frustrating, because today in this information economy, education beyond high school is it's called the passport to the American dream. It used to be you could achieve the American dream if you worked hard. You could graduate from high school, work hard, get a job, and make enough money to get into the middle class. That is no longer, it's now almost impossible. Education beyond high school is required. Increasingly, young women are getting it, men are not. And yet a young man who let's say, doesn't go beyond high school and looks at all the girls in his school that are going on to college, he might resent the fact that he's disparaged and called toxic. And I mean, that whole vocabulary that became, not in all schools of feminism, but there were some sort of male averse schools that developed in our universities that cast masculinity in a bad light and looked only at the most aberrational behavior of men. Now, it's true, men are more violent. If you look at who's in jail for murder, violent crimes and so forth, men are, but men as a group sort of succeed and fail at the extremes. So you do find more males, CEOs of Fortune 500s, and you find more males in maximum security prisons. Men are found at the extremes. But the average man does not have the privilege of a man who's a CEO of a Fortune 500, nor is he a villain or, like a murderer. And yet the vocabulary in some schools of feminism take the worst examples of masculinity, as well as the most privileged. And then they measure, women according to that. And women, of course, aren't as privileged as the CEO, and they're not nearly as bad as the mass murderer, who typically are men. So all of that is unreasonable. What I've always said is you should look, how is the average man doing? Is he earning more? Is he going farther? Is he healthier? Does he live longer? And what I find is if I look at men and women in American society, and probably Israeli society, it's a complicated mix of burdens and benefits for each sex. There are some ways in which it's an advantage to be a man, but in many ways it's advantageous to be a woman. You just can't say who is better off. It's complicated. And I just wish we had a women's movement that could acknowledge that simple human reality.
But didn't we, because I think I read one time that you said that the way you looked at yourself was that you were like the liberal feminism, the first wave feminism that wanted equal rights for everyone and not equal outcomes or not fighting against the other sex.
Exactly.
Right. So maybe just give us the rundown, the basic rundown of what is the difference between the first feminists, the ones who were fighting for the equal rights to vote and to work and to leave the house in different places where they weren't allowed to, basic stuff, that just freedoms to do whatever they wish to do. And the feminism of today, the third wave or fourth wave or whatever we want to call it, that looks at basically, like you just said, that there's almost a war between the sexes.
Right. It's sort of a gender war feminism. I reject that, but I do embrace first wave equality feminism. An equality feminist is someone who wants for women what she wants for everyone: fair treatment, no discrimination, no arbitrary barriers, equal opportunity. And equality feminism has been a huge success story across the world. There are still many societies that have not had so much.
Yeah, look at our neighbors here.
Yeah, they have not had, so not merely have they not had a first or second wave, they haven't had a ripple. So that's still the unfinished work of first wave feminism, is women across the globe who are still living in oppressive patriarchies. But American women, Israeli women, we're not living in an oppressive patriarchy. We're living in a complicated society where, as I said, it's hard to say who's doing better. It depends on the domain. Oh, what's that? Anyway, to answer your question, that feminism, and it came out of the European Enlightenment and developed through philosophers like John Stuart Mill and before him, Mary Wollstonecraft. Later, there were all sorts of legal reforms in the 1960s and early 70s. And in the United States, it was a coalition of Republican and Democratic leaders. Sometimes it was even a Republican Supreme Court that passed laws that removed sort of barriers to women and opened up medical school. The first wave of feminism basically freed women and gave them equality. It takes time for society to change, but legally the barriers came down, the obstacles came down. However, there were many feminists, especially in the universities, who just wouldn't take yes for an answer. And they insisted that despite women in America and in Western Europe, Israel, Australia, other parts of the world, thriving and succeeding in ways unprecedented in history, every year making more and more progress, despite all that progress, they declared women in these societies captive to a repressive patriarchal system. They said women's oppression was systemic, that liberal reforms would never liberate women because the oppression of women was too deeply embedded in all of the institutions. So they adopted a fairly radical view about the systemic oppression of women, and basically it had a kind of revolutionary vocabulary and view, and they needed to sustain this sort of extreme philosophy of about women's oppression in the face of liberation.
Exactly.
They depended on a lot of statistics about hidden oppression, and a whole generation of young women were fed statistics. 1 in 3 is battered, and 1 in 4 college girls is raped. And, I remember reading in many, many places in the women's studies literature that 50,000 American women die every year from an eating disorder, anorexia nervosa. which one feminist said that's a disease caused not by nature, but by men, that women were starving themselves and to meet the standards of slender beauty. And well, it turned out I looked into most of these statistics, and they were just wildly exaggerated. The anorexia statistic, how many young women die of anorexia every year? They were saying 50,000. And this was repeated by Gloria Steinem and Naomi Wolf. It was in women's studies textbooks for years. The actual figure is fewer than 1,000. I think the last time I checked, most of them suicides. All these deaths are tragic. But to say that it's 50,000, that many Americans, I don't know, when I was growing up, that many people die on the highways every year from car accidents. It was a crisis. This is different. And it's not caused by men. I mean, the whole analysis was inadequate and unhelpful. But imagine you're a young woman, you're in your college classroom, your professor is telling you that you're likely you have a high percentage of being raped and battered, especially by a boyfriend or husband. And that's only if you're not already dead from an eating disorder. It's a very grim view. And they told these girls they're robbed of their self-esteem, cheated out of their fair share of their salary, and so forth. In every case, what I found was just a body of egregiously false information. If the foundation of modern feminism is false information. I'll give you an example most people can relate to. We constantly hear that women are cheated out of, 25% of their, for the same job.
Pay gap.
The pay gap, yeah. A woman is paid, let's say, 73 cents on the dollar. 73 cents for what a man would be paid $1. What that statistic depends on is just looking at all men and women working full-time and doing the averages. It does not take into account how many hours do you work per week, what is your profession, and what is your educational background. Now, if you go to school and you study Victorian literature or art history or anthropology, it might be very rewarding, but it is not highly remunerative. If you study early childhood education, it might be rewarding, but it's the lowest paying profession. You will make much more. The highest paying profession, I think, was petroleum engineering or naval architecture, things like that. Now, the majority of majors in engineering are men. And the majority of majors in early childhood education are women. Now, right there, that explains some of the pay gap. Now, people will say, well, that's because we should be paying early childhood educators as much as we pay engineers. Well, I don't know what to say to that. It takes it's just a lot harder to become an engineer. There are a lot fewer people that want to do it and can do it. There are women that are succeeding brilliantly, but it's still more men than women. And even people say, well, wait a minute, even women engineers earn less than men. True, but then you have to look at what is their specialty. So if you are an electrical engineer, you earn more than if you are an environmental engineer. Majority or women tend to go into environmental engineering, bioengineering more than petroleum or electric. You have to look at these variables when you factor in these sorts of concerns. What happens is the wage gap narrows, and by some studies, it vanishes.
But could I just interject about something that I hear a lot is that the reason why women go to, for example, educational fields and men go, for example, like you said, to engineering is that society pushes them or teaches them from a young age. This is what a lot of the nouveau feminists would say. It basically, I forgot the exact word, but it from a young age, you're taught that this is the role of a woman and this is the role of a man. And that is why the women will go automatically towards education and the man will go towards engineering. And I guess the crux of the matter is that their basic claim is that there is no difference between men and women. And that if you dare to say that there is a difference, then you're like a chauvinist or a patriarchal supporter or something. So I guess where I feel that it's like it's like almost everybody realizes that there is a difference, but you're not allowed to say that there is a difference. I think that's where we are as a society right now.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with that. I have looked at efforts to change the way children play. For example, many feminists have said exactly what you just said. Well, children were shaped
Yeah.
by the stereotypes, and the conventional femininity is just this set of expectations we impose on little girls, and conventional masculinity we impose on boys. Boys wouldn't naturally want to play with trucks, or write stories about a monster coming in and taking over, the city. They would, girls tend to not write stories like that. They say, well, they were shaped by society to do that. Just try to change the play preferences of little kids. They stubbornly refuse. And many schools have tried. There are schools in Sweden that have gone to wild extremes to eliminate gendered play in the classroom. What happens is you have to become a full-time sort of gender police woman. Most of the teachers are women. You have to watch the kids because the boys will constantly revert to conventional, typical male behavior. I read about a school where this sort of liberal mother had sent her son, and he was constantly in trouble they would have a garden with organic vegetables, and the girls would constructively plant, and then the boys would take the sticks for where they grow the tomato vines and have sword fights constantly. And this is the problem, because this is going on in our classrooms. Little boys, teachers like the way girls play better. The typical play of little girls is imaginative, theatrical games, playing house, playing school, also turn-taking games, or sitting with your best friend and exchanging confidences. You don't see that with most boys.
Yeah.
What you see is called rough and tumble play. Now, girls do it too, but boys do it constantly.
On a different level.
A whole different level, and it involves a lot of chasing, sound effects, mock fighting. Now, some people say, "Oh, well, it's proto-violence." That's exactly what it is not. There are experts like on childhood playground dynamics, like Anthony Pellegrini at the University of Minnesota has shown that this kind of play is found cross-culturally. It's the healthy, natural play of little boys everywhere, even in other species you see it. The males have this more obstreperous play. And if you are constantly disapproving, banning, and scolding them, and they're getting in trouble, you have to wonder, is it any surprise that boys like school less, seem to have adjusted less, are doing worse? And I think our schools are increasingly feminized. They're more emotion-centered. They're more sort of, the kids are encouraged to sort of sit still and be calm and play the way girls play. And I have two sons. I was astonished at some of the hijinks, but you have to be careful because to acknowledge and respect the difference.
Yeah. Christina, one of the things that when I said it's built on a lie is that one thing that you talked about was that in, for example, gender studies, but not, I think also sociology, and even I studied poli-sci. I think that you have a lot of gender theories that are taught to students. So all of these things, they're teaching people a lot of times that all men or a lot of men are rapists, potential murderers. They're, all this stuff. And at the same time, all of these women are going out with these men to dates, to meeting, to parties. And so it seems to me that everyone knows that it's a game, or most people understand that even those professors, most of them don't really believe the things that they're teaching. Because if they did, they wouldn't allow men into their classroom. They wouldn't walk in the street with men. They would be treating men in a much different and more suspicious way than they actually are. And so it's very, very sad that a society is built on a lie, and everybody's playing along with the lie, I think, because they're scared to point out that it's a lie. And so it's a very bad dynamic, because you want society to be built on people being able to speak the truth and speak what they actually do believe in. And it just seems to me that that's a very bad way to live life.
It's a bad way, and I agree with everything you said. That they must know. I mean, I've often wondered, haven't they had sons?
Yeah.
And haven't they seen for themselves? And I think they do see it, but they somehow, the theory is so powerful, the appeal of having this total explanation based on these dominance hierarchies, and men are the privileged sex, the privileged, the unprivileged, this intersectional typology has just proved irresistible to so many intellectuals that it astonishes me. I mean, one obvious thing that they will talk about, we said before, toxic masculinity, and it exists. There is such a thing as toxic masculinity, men who prey on other people and who destroy and wreak havoc. Barbarians. I mean, it's you can see it, but that's not most men. Most men are the very opposite. There is toxic masculinity, but there's also healthy masculinity. And a healthy male, he doesn't prey on weaker people. He protects. He doesn't destroy. He builds. And it's almost as if we're a society, we just forgot that the majority of men embody an unhonorable masculinity, and to disparage them in this way, this kind of vicious stereotype. And I mean, most men will be okay, but I really worry about little boys. And if they have a mother who thinks that way and is going to be sort of have a disapprove of his every manifestation of characteristic boyness, then he goes to school where it's majority teachers. And now psychology, the field of psychology, has been feminized. It's majority women. It didn't used to be women, you know, after the first wave of feminism and the second wave, when the laws all changed, wherever women wanted to go, they went. You couldn't stop them.
Right.
So women were very interested in psychology. It used to be male dominated. Now it's vastly more female dominant. So, but but feminist theory has permeated the way it's taught. The official program of the American Psychological Association, they had a whole study of toxic masculinity, which was so ideological and harsh and just not scientific at all. But what worried me is if you had a boy who had a real psychological problem and you took him to a psychologist, you better find out make sure she's not captive to some weird ideology that is going to help him by liberating him from his masculinity.
Yeah. One of the things that I think we should be talking about when we speak about all these issues is the fact that I think in the last maybe decade, but more in the last, since I think we can say George Floyd protests, is that this whole woke culture took over the entire culture of the West, especially in America. And I think we could sum up, at least in my opinion, the woke way of thinking is that any difference of outcomes must be because of institutional racism, sexism, whatever. And so then they look at, for example, if there's not enough women in the Department of Engineering, that means that there has to be institutional, I guess. But on the other hand, let me just ask, what do you think about this woke thing? Is it feminist?
Some have analyzed it that way, that with the sort of wokeification of America was actually, it went along with the feminization of the university and the media, that you were just seeing kind of women taking over, and that, I think that explains some of it. But it's also, it really goes back to the attraction, I think, to utopian theories.
Yeah.
And they often depend on a kind of simplistic uh, analysis of good and evil, and then you start to see the whole world through this prism of oppressor and oppressed. That's
Exactly.
intersectionality, and so everybody has a place in this kind of map of good and evil. And men are on the bad side. Privilege is replace evil in this typology, and females are, the oppressed, so that's good. And then it depends. Well, as a female, are you gay? That's
Right.
even better.
And if you're trans, it's even
Oh,
better.
that's better.
And if you're trans and like racial minority, it's the best of the best. And
It's best. And notice that if you have arguments with people, it's not based on the cogency of your
right.
thinking. The value of what you say is based on your identity,
Right.
your gender identity and your racial and so forth. And now that is absurd. And however, what's happened in the United States is on our college campuses, many young people have been taught this. It's kind of easy to learn, and it's supposed to be exciting. And I do kind of remember the first time I read the Communist Manifesto in my, Mr. Holby's English class at University High School in West Los Angeles. I just thought, oh, this is so true. Of course, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. It just seems so humane and nice. And why should there be, why shouldn't everybody be the same? Well, of course, as a kid, you think of the world as your family. Then, and you're taken care of. And so I think it's kind of a naive take. But I outgrew that. And just came to see the world, and it's more complicated. But this is a temptation, and every generation battles with it. And then we're all very angry because some of us go and say, that's ridiculous. And you have to take into account human nature, which is, there are going to be people that are not going to cooperate no matter what. They're going to be people who are heroic and angelic, and you can't determine that by race, class, gender. They turn up everywhere. Yeah. It's just the way it is. But that's not how they see the world, and everything is it's so totalitarian in the sense that everything is just reduced to this abject simplicity, which makes it attractive, but also makes it dangerous and repulsive to me.
Well, isn't it weird that the places of higher learning where you're supposed to not be simplistic, you're supposed to study the complexities of the issues, those are the main places where we're going to the simplistic worldview. And the reason, and what I wanted to ask you was to maybe take this to where we've seen with these protests against Israel. So we've seen these encampments. I mean, I grew up in New York, so my aunt lives next to NYU. We saw these encampments there, Columbia, Harvard, and all these places. And I have two quick maybe observations/questions. So the first thing that I noticed was that you had two groups. One was the Islamists, which, okay, I fully expect them to be where they are. The second were these woke, young, usually white kids.
Usually women, too.
And that is my second point. They're usually young women who usually study the social sciences, and which we all spoke about now. And they are taught from a young age that oppressor dynamic. And everything in the world they see through that. And therefore, if they're taught that the Palestinians, for example, are the oppressed, then Israel must be the oppressor. And therefore, they're all out in arms with the Islamists that would kill them if they would have the chance, because a lot of them are lesbians and trans, and they are for gay rights and women's rights, which aren't existent. Exactly. So my question is, what is going on in terms of, like you said, a lot of the people used to be into it, they outgrew it. But are you hopeful? Because it seems that it's much more prevalent than it ever was, this worldview.
Oh, I'm hopeful that they'll outgrow it. And when I outgrew it and became just in the universities, I became very critical of this movement. And my best allies were people who had been leftists and radicals before. they make the best anti-Marxists and so forth. So I think we're going to recruit, a lot of people are going to be horrified at what they did, and I'll tell you why. And I hope this gives some solace to Israelis. They don't know these kids, with few exceptions, don't know anything about the Middle East. They know nothing about Israel. They know nothing about anything really, because our educational system, starting now especially in our elite schools, has replaced a lot of sort of classical, history and political science and so forth with this intersectional analysis. And so when they go and protest Israel or are siding with Hamas in many cases, they have no idea what it all means. They have translated, according to this mindless theory that makes you stupid. Youth intersectional is silly, simplistic intersectional analysis makes you foolish and amoral or immoral, in my opinion, because it's so insensitive to reality and to the human complexity and to facts.
To Western values, I think, just in general, of freedom,
Western
fairness,
values, and how everyone couldn't be. What happened in Israel on October 7th? Any civilized person couldn't just be so horrified and just stand back in horror at this. It was almost like the 9th century barbarians coming and clashing with the contemporary world. And yet they didn't take a minute, many of them, and certainly some of the professors who should have known better, but they have their own agendas. They whipped these kids into a frenzy, and they thought they were defending, like they were marching with Martin Luther King. They thought it was just a simple justice for the oppressed. And I can't help but think many of them will eventually think, read and think their way out of it, because
I hope you're right.
I pray I'm right, or we're all in trouble. And also, by the way, when they're protesting and they show that hatred to Israel, they hate the United States just as much.
For sure. How do you explain? But exactly, how do you? I always say that in all these protests, there's not one American flag, and on the pro-Israeli protests, you'll have Israeli and American flags. I have friends that were just in a protest in D.C. and they sang the national anthem, the American national anthem, before the protest, for the speeches were and everything, and in the protest of the pro-Hamas protest, you'll have them ripping down statues and all these kind of stuff.
Oh, and covering their faces. I mean, you don't see masks at these pro-Israel protests.
But I want to ask you one more which it's more anecdotal, but maybe you'll have opinions on it. That it seems to me that whenever I'm looking at these protesters and these kids, and they're paying 60,000, 70,000 a year in Colombia for this trash education, they are the elite of the elite. Whoever who's going to Colombia and is, even if he's not paying it from his own pocket, he's someone who's privileged.
Yes.
He has more money than I do at the age of 18, and I live in Israel in an apartment building somewhere, and I never would dream to study at Columbia. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, like, you're a privileged person. It's fine to be privileged. I wish I was privileged. I'm not looking at it from that kind of like envious way. It's just what it is. And then they all seem very unhappy. So when you look at their faces, they're all angry. They're all like depressed. They seem to be, especially the women. It seems a lot of the leaders of the protest are women. And just as someone who studies and has written about what's happening in the thinking of the modern feminist movement and what they're teaching young women and about the world, about when they go out into the world, they're sitting on campus, they're paying 60,000, or their parents are paying, or they took out loans. This is like the elite of the entire world, not just of the US, and they're so depressed. How do you explain it?
Well, you're actually right. We've got data on the number of young people in our colleges who seek psychiatric help or who are on psychotropic drugs. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I think some of the kids at the demonstrations show signs of serious personality disorders, especially those who are most vocal. I've seen them, acting out in ways which suggest pathology. But I think it goes back to you know, you take the child who is fragile and suggestionable, and you give them this very aggressive philosophy, a twisted theory about the world on this foundation of lies, of untruths, where you exaggerate the horror, whatever it is, they'll exaggerate it. They'll say, even when we had riots after the George Floyd, people were saying, thousands and thousands of African Americans are killed by police every year.
And I think it's 14 a year, right? Something like
that. Of unarmed,
yeah.
It's very rare, and yes, very small number. And the data doesn't support it, but people would create, either promote false information. So they get false information, they get the twisted theories about their society. That's why I say the hatred of American society, even the way American history is taught, it's just an unrelieved, series of atrocities. You would never know that it was, a society that was, represented all the hopes of people across the world. That, of course, we made mistakes, but what was amazing is where we went right, not just where we went wrong, and all the heroes and what was achieved. And it's just exhausting because they don't learn the history. They learn this copybook, cartoonish, where, everybody in America is just guilty from the beginning, and just an unbelievable dystopian hellscape, except that it's the freest, among the freest countries in the world. And to this day, it's the place people across the world admire and dream to and come to. But that's how what they're taught. And that's just got to change, because it's got what's being taught in this animus, this anger towards Israel, is based on not learning. They don't know the history of the Middle East. They don't know the history of the Second World War. They're telling Jews in the protests, go back to Poland.
My grandparents grew up in Poland. They ran away after their whole family were slaughtered. So, I mean, So also, I just think that if you really hate the country that you live in, you shouldn't live in that country. So if you think that America is so bad from its core, it's rotten to its core, you shouldn't be living in America. You should be going to I don't know, go to Gaza, go to Jordan, go to Egypt, wherever. Go to Iran. They seem to love there. I'm not sure where.
I would like. But this is the other thing. You mentioned Iran. Why isn't the American feminist movement making common cause with the dissidents in Iran? That those Iranian women who protest the mullahs, they are the bravest feminists in the history of the planet. I mean, American feminists never faced anything like that. I mean, they would sometimes get arrested, or their parents would disapprove, or they'd have, they paid a price personally, but they weren't, executed. I mean, the mullahs have gouged out women's eyes. People are tortured and murdered, and I mean, the whole thing is so sinister. And yet, not a word. You hear not a word from the organized women's movement, the feminist movement across most of Europe and the United States. And it's absolutely inexcusable.
Yeah, and I would just say that I interviewed a woman, her name was Yasmin Mohammed. She grew up in Canada to an Islamist family, and she was forced married to an Al-Qaeda member in Canada, and the authorities knew about it and it did nothing. And only when they were going to take their child to be mutilated, basically, and they were going to take. That's when they're going to do female circumcision on her little girl, and that is when she ran away. And still, the authorities didn't in the beginning even help her. And I'm thinking, these are things that are happening. You know what? Take Iran out of the table. These are things that are actually physically happening. But because of this intersectional thing, the authorities were, we don't want to upset the culture.
Right.
We don't want to, so it's they have it on the one hand, they'll go after the West and the women and the way they treat women, which is we spoke about it the whole 40 minutes already, about how a lot of it is based on a lie. But when it's
Right.
really happening, a lot of times they'll say, okay, we don't want to get involved with these things. They might say
I
we're
know.
racist. They might say we're racist, we're Islamophobic, we're this and that. And so you have this dynamic where when there's actual women being persecuted, they'll be quiet. So it's just a very weird dynamic. I wanted to ask you something that also I saw that you wrote about and spoke about and speak about, I think, until this day, about the academic freedom and freedom of speech, where you basically say, and I agree with you, that there is a lot of times you'll have only one opinion that is the right opinion, and all other opinions will be basically not allowed to be heard in a lot of our academic institutions. So maybe give us a little bit about your experiences and how you see this, and if there's any solution to the problem, because I think a lot of, like, Harvard, when you see who the former president was, the one at the Congress, where it's just like, maybe there is no fixing for these places. We need to make new institutions.
Yeah, Claudine Gay.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this is the problem, is that there are many, many professors who think that the purpose of their classroom isn't to help students learn about the world and develop their own point of view and give them the tools to think more clearly and reason more, sharply. And what they do is try to give them a worldview,
Exactly.
to help them, see the world as they do. And I taught philosophy many, many years. I never saw it as my job to get them to agree with my opinions. I'm not even certain of most of my opinions. I mean, I'm open to, not, some of them I'm certain, but many I'm open to correction. And I try to cultivate that openness to counter evidence in my students. And so when we would treat any controversial topic, I would try to find the best articles for and against. Yeah. So they would, and there's that wonderful sense you get in philosophy when you might read these great papers that really convince you that you should be a determinist, on this metaphysical question of, are we free? And you think, oh yeah, I'm a determinist. And then you read some beautiful paper that takes apart and makes the case for freedom, free will, just as an example. And then you think, oh, I didn't see that. Yeah, that. And then then you go back and read something, and you go that back and forth. That's when you're really developing intellectually and changing. As soon as I looked at women's studies textbooks, and on one occasion taught the feminist theory class, I saw that these books and these classrooms were not based on arguments, counter arguments, and looking at and learning how to evaluate. They were there all the readings were sort of mutually reinforcing about this theory of patriarchal oppression seen from an intersectional perspective and so on. So if somebody comes in with a different point of view, that's just wasting their time. If their job is to get you to adopt this radical worldview, the best thing they can do is just not let the students see you at all. So sometimes I would go to campuses to give a lecture in favor of moderate feminism and free speech and due process and so forth. And they would boycott, or in more recent years, they would protest and give trigger warnings. In one case, I spoke at, where was it? Oberlin College, very, very liberal Oberlin College. And the students created a safe room where they could flee, if my lecture was too traumatizing. And like 30 young women fled the room, 30 young women and a therapy dog. I triggered a dog.
What do you mean? You were talking and then they all got up and ran away?
They all ran away, including this dog. And he was seemed kind of nervous. I feel bad about that, but it was ridiculous. And then they had a whole program to de-traumatize the students. It was all therapeutic, weird, unnecessary, and ludicrous. And the people who invited me there were very left-wing professors, but they weren't intersectional and they weren't carried away. And they were just horrified by what was happening at the campus. And I went out to dinner with them later and heard their stories. And so there are a lot of professors who don't go along with this, but they've been silenced, and and especially if they're white males, they don't dare say a thing.
Right.
So
Right. They can't use their oppression like other people that may
right.
be women or minorities, but white men are like straight, especially if they're straight. They're the worst of the worst.
That's it. Yeah, that's the uber, oppressor. So you can't say a thing, and they will in these spaces, as they would like to say, the men are told, you just sit and you listen, and what are they afraid of? I mean, they're afraid that someone's going to try to reason with them
Right.
and might have better arguments, and so they call that aggression. Well, that begins to sound like someone that's just captive to some conspiracy theory,
Almost a cult.
almost a cult. It operates like a cult. And going back to those kids at the demonstration,
Yes.
I see those faces. If you look at the eyes and the anger, the single-minded,
Yes.
the
And the
venomous
chants, they're all chanting the same thing over
the
and over. There's a
chants.
leader usually that chants and they all chant after her or after him.
Oh,
And
it's
they're all,
just
yeah,
yes, it has a cultic
yeah.
vibe.
But also, I guess one of the things that you hear more and more is that speech itself on these campuses is considered violence. So, for example, someone like you or even me would come to talk to them on a lot of these campuses. They would be protesting you because what you're saying is violence for them. They say it. It's not a.
Well,
It's
this
not,
is very interesting. This is very interesting because, and I wonder if this is going to have to change. So they have this whole theory about microaggressions, and
yes.
microaggressions are just things people will say, offhanded remarks that seem innocent, but they actually reinforce the structures of oppression. So let's say you meet a person from another country, but or you meet someone who's, let's say, Asian, and you assume they're from another country. And so you say, oh, what country are you from? And they're American. So that's a micro, but you're reminding them that they're really the other and not
Yeah.
part of it. But then anything, you would have young women that didn't want, even in law schools, not wanting to treat any laws, around battery of women or rape. They would say that was traumatizing, and that wasn't exactly a microaggression, but it could be traumatizing to have anything upsetting or distressing to someone who was a survivor of these oppressive systems. Well, what's interesting now is that Jewish kids are pointing out that having a teacher, wearing a keffiyeh, this just happened this week. Some high school student was taking a class, I think, at Columbia, and the teacher was wearing a keffiyeh, and this 16, 17-year-old said, I find it,
Right.
it's traumatizing. Or the teacher would say something about against Israel. They thought it was an aggression, a microaggression in some way. Now it's going to be interesting what the schools are going to do with this.
Well,
Because
Jewish people are considered white adjacent, so I don't think we're because also I think if you think about it, the whole intersectionality ladder is basically done by which groups are considered successful and which are not. So Asians are considered successful; they're also white adjacent, which is why Harvard could maybe not accept them, even though they have good scores, a lot of them. And Jewish people the same, because we're successful financially, politically, whatever. So I think that's basically the issue, is that the more successful a group is on average, the more you're allowed to discriminate against it.
yeah, but that's true if you're an intersectional,
Yeah.
but the majority of the deans and so forth, they're not necessarily
I hope so.
ideologues. They're careerists, and
Yeah.
also some of them had a conventional education, and they know that anti-Semitism is as real as any other form of bigotry. And not in the United States right now, most of the hate crimes are against Jews.
Yeah.
So that they would have to. I think that they're not going to do that. I mean, I think it's probably better not to have these, just let people deal with it,
Yeah.
and if I want academic freedom. I mean, I wish people weren't. I mean, I do think some of our universities to have professors who are sociopaths, and I hope we can change that. Not the majority, but enough. And
Yeah.
I think recent events have given them a podium. But on the other hand, it's allowed others to see. So,
I have
there's
one
a
last
lot of
right.
donors to universities
Yeah.
have seen this. And this is not what, and there are a lot of Jewish donors.
Yes.
A very, very important source of support in our major universities, especially our elite universities. Well, they have not enjoyed that, and they're not devout intersectional ideologues. So hoping this will just cause, an occasion for a reckoning over all of this language and to work out something that is neutral and fair for all students that protects basic freedoms for all.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
We spoke about it with Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary, but also the former president of Harvard. And he said that he didn't realize how much the Marxist theories permeated the university until he saw what's happening now and how he finds it, he can't believe it, basically, as a Jewish person, too. I have one last thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which also has to do with college campuses. One of the things that Biden basically did was Title IX. They just opened it up a bit and brought back basically what Obama administration did in terms of the trials that they have on campus, meaning that if a student woman accuses a student man of sexual assault, his due process rights are basically totally out the window at this point, it seems to me, because they have these internal courts where the woman is basically, he can't cross-examine her, no one from his side, it's all anonymous, and he could be expelled on these, and a lot of these charges have been proven to be not true over the years.
Absolutely.
So why do you think that it's become sort of like a liberal thing? Liberals used to be for rights for even the Nazis. And now it's become that there's no rights. You can't defend yourself. You can't even question the person who's accusing you. And we're basically going to punish you without your ability, your most basic right.
Well, many years ago, these feminist activists did their own studies. These were not studies that were done by criminologists, or this is not reflected in the data by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and determined that our campuses were what they call a rape culture, and that girls were just, you had a very high chance of being raped the moment you came on campus. Now, anyone who looks at these studies can quickly see that they were just unreliable in every way and vague definitions, and you could easily get false positives.
Yeah.
And they were able to declare this crisis of sexual violence, at Yale University, at Columbia University, these hothouse places where probably the safest places in the world for a young woman, but they became convinced that it was otherwise, and so they implemented these procedures that circumvent due process.
Yes.
And what you would find, they kind of reinvented like Salem witch trials, where you were guilty because accused.
Yes.
And there was no way to defend yourself. Now, we've had a number of young men who went to the courts and who have won. Usually it's settled out of court. The university pays a lot of money to make it go away. And then in the Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education in the Trump administration, had a period of time where she let everyone come in. She had a lot of, meetings and workshops and things where public events where people could argue for and against different policies. And they worked out some very reasonable policies where you would protect the rights of the accused, but you would respect the dignity of the accuser. And everyone thought that No, what happened as soon as the Biden administration came, they tried to overturn it and go back to what I consider to be witch trials.
And the
And
thing
so,
is that, Chris, just let me jump in that even if you're, I think if you're a woman, a lot of times you'll say, you know, what's the problem with this? Women could be attacked and we shouldn't have to, you know, go through unnecessary whatever. But the point is that a lot of women then become mothers to boys, and these boys are going to schools right now. And if anyone could basically charge anyone, and then your son doesn't have the ability to fight the charges, even if he is innocent, then even as a woman, you should be appalled at this, it seems to me.
well, also understand that a lot of the cases were instances where both people were drunk.
Uh-huh.
And there was no overt coercion. It wasn't that if you're drunk and someone's saying no, that could be a rape, but this was consensual sex after you'd had drinks.
Right. Then they woke up and they're like, oh, what did we do? And I'm saying this is
Yeah,
a rape.
and so then they said, well, no woman can consent if she's had been drinking, which, if you think about it, could turn like a lot of sex into rape.
Yeah.
And then why do we assume that if it's only the woman that can be, if the man, if they're both equally drunk, or did they rape each other? I once asked that in a debate with a law professor at the University of Virginia. I said, what if they've both been drinking?
Right.
And they're both just completely drunk and they have sex. Would you say they raped each other? And she said, well, that would be a possibility. You know, at that point, it's so absurd. And it also trivializes the
real rapes. Yeah.
crime of rape.
Yeah.
And so that's what you have to know is the definition of rape has been enlarged to include drunken sex where both are consenting to it.
Yeah, I have to say that it's very depressing, the whole conversation on the one hand, but I did take from you that you were positive that a lot of, because of the extremes that it's been going to, a lot of people are waking up and saying this is not the way we want things to be. And so that is one of the things that I did find positive, even though a lot of it is very, very depressing.
A lot of it's very negative, but I will tell you the horrible things we've seen on campus after October. So that opened a lot of eyes. And more than that, it's allowed people who previously had been quiet, it's allowed them to speak up.
Yes.
It's given them the moral courage to speak up. And I'd be very surprised if we don't see change. It takes a while. It doesn't happen all at once. But I think you're going to see, and we're already seeing, colleges go back towards more freedom,
reasonable,
and more reason, and having diversity of ideas. Have that be central. The pursuit of truth be their mission, rather than indoctrinating kids in some twisted theory. My view it's twisted. They don't really say that.
Yeah.
And so I'm hopeful about that. That we've had this example and we know something is wrong.
So on that note, a positive note, even though most of this was depressing, even though I do think that the fact that me and you could talk about these things without, well, maybe because I'm here and you already went through all these battles, so you're not worried about it. But I think a lot of people will watch and listen to what we're saying and feel connected and feel that they understand and agree with us. And even if they're scared to speak up, the more people listen and agree, we'll see hopefully gradual change. So I am optimistic. And I think in Israel, one of the things that I would say is that maybe to my Israeli audience, after talking to you about the problems in America, is that I think one of the big problems in America is that the church has totally been, especially among young people, they're very lonely. And they don't go to congregation. They don't meet friends. I think a lot of what we see in these protests are very lonely, depressed people. And I think that breeds a lot of this radicalism and a lot of this sort of anger at society. And whereas in Israel, we're more of for better or for worse, a lot more traditional. Most Israelis go to synagogue at least once a month. And and
you're having children
Yes, and we're like the only Western country that still has kids, and I think and I think the reason why we have kids is because we're family oriented and we like being part of large groups of people meeting and hanging out, and I think that grounds you in a way that used to be like 34 years ago in America. Most people would go out to drink, they would meet girls at the bar. Nowadays, you're all meeting girls online. You're not
Yeah,
even meeting
yeah.
girls. I think there was a poll that said that young people in America don't have sex anymore because they're on porn all day, a lot more than in the past. And so I think maybe those are the differences, for better or for worse. There's a lot of things in Israeli society that I'm critical of, but I think on this issue, we do have a little more to be hopeful for. But hopefully America will catch up. So thank you so much, Christina Hoff Sommers. It was a pleasure talking to you.